Imagine building an empire so vast that it stretched across every ocean on earth. Ships carrying your name through the Persian Gulf, the Atlantic, the Pacific. A private island in Greece, a legendary yacht that hosted kings and prime ministers, a marriage to the most famous woman in the world. Imagine having all of that, every dream a man could reach for, and still dying broken in a hospital bed, clutching a blanket given to you by the woman you abandoned. That was Aristotle Onassis, the man who rose from the ashes of a burning city with $250 in his pocket and built one of the greatest private fortunes the world had ever seen. The man who charmed opera queens and American royalty. The man who seemed untouchable, unbreakable, almost mythological in his power and ambition. And yet at the end of his life, not $1 of the billions he had accumulated could save him from the grief that consumed him. This is the story of a man who won every battle that could be won with money, power, and cunning, and lost the only battle that truly mattered. But before we get to the fall, we have to understand the fire. Because everything Aristotle Onassis would become was forged in a single catastrophic moment that most people alive today have never heard of. A moment that took place in September of 1922 in a port city on the coast of what is now Turkey, and changed the course of one young boy's life forever. Keep that fire in mind, we'll come back to it. Aristotle Socrates Onassis was born on January 20th, 1906 in Karataş, a suburb of the ancient port city of Smyrna. Smyrna sat on the western coast of what was then the Ottoman Empire, a city so cosmopolitan and so prosperous that people called it the Paris of the East. Greeks, Turks, Armenians, Jews, Italians, they all lived side by side in this rich port city where the goods of 3 continents passed through on their way to the rest of the world. Aristotle's father, Socrates Onassis, was a successful tobacco merchant and a modest shipping entrepreneur. The family belonged to Smyrna's prosperous Greek community and lived comfortably. Young Aristotle attended the local evangelical Greek school where his sharp mind absorbed languages with remarkable ease. By the time he was 16, he could speak Greek, Turkish, Spanish, and English, 4 languages. At 16, in a family of merchants, that kind of talent was worth more than any inheritance. The future looked bright, the kind of bright that makes a family comfortable and a boy ambitious. Aristotle grew up surrounded by the smell of sea air and tobacco, watching his father's ships come and go, learning the rhythms of commerce and trade from the time he could walk. He was being shaped, without knowing it, for something much larger than anyone around him could imagine. Then history intervened in the most brutal way possible. After the Allied victory in World War I, Smyrna had been returned to Greek control. The city's Greek population celebrated. It felt like the beginning of a new era. But then the Greco-Turkish War of 1919 to 1922 erupted, and in September of 1922, Turkish forces retook the city. What followed was one of the great catastrophes of the early 20th century. The Great Fire of Smyrna. The city burned for days. The Greek and Armenian quarters were consumed entirely. Hundreds of thousands of people fled to the waterfront, desperate to escape on any vessel that would take them. The chaos was unimaginable. Families were separated, people drowned, and amid the smoke and the screaming, the Onassis family's world collapsed entirely. 3 of Aristotle's uncles, an aunt, her husband, and their daughter were burned to death inside a church in the nearby town of Akhisar, where 500 Christians had taken shelter hoping the walls would protect them. They did not. The Asia Minor catastrophe of 1922 was not just a political event. For the Onassis family, it was the destruction of everything they had built across generations. The property holdings, the business connections, the social standing, all of it swept away in smoke and flame. Aristotle's father was imprisoned by the Turkish authorities, and the family business was transferred to Turkish ownership. The rest of the family fled to Greece, settling in Athens in an outdoor refugee camp alongside hundreds of thousands of other Greeks who had lost their homes in the disaster. 16 years old, a refugee with almost nothing, watching his world burn from the deck of a ship. Most people would have been destroyed by that, and in a way, Aristotle was. The boy who left Smyrna was not the same boy who had grown up there. Something hardened in him on that dock, something changed that would never fully change back. He had learned the most brutal lesson life can teach. Nothing is permanent. Nothing is safe. Everything you build can be taken from you in a single terrible moment. But here is the paradox that would define his entire life. In losing everything, he also discovered something. He discovered that he had nothing left to fear. When you have already survived the worst, ordinary risks stop looking frightening, and ordinary ambitions stop looking satisfying. Within a year, Aristotle had made his decision. He would not stay in Greece rebuilding the small, comfortable life his father had managed before. He would go somewhere new, somewhere with no history, no limits, no ceiling on what a determined young man could become. He would go to Argentina. On August 21st, 1923, Aristotle Onassis landed in Buenos Aires with $250 in his pocket and a Nansen passport, the document issued to stateless refugees. He was 17 years old, he knew nobody, he had no guaranteed job waiting for him, no safety net, just the memory of a burning city and a hunger that would not quiet down. Buenos Aires would either make him or break him. He had already been broken once. This time he intended to do the making. Buenos Aires in 1923 was not kind to penniless Greek refugees. Aristotle took whatever work he could find. He carried hot and washed dishes, he slept in cheap lodging and ate cheaply. He was doing what immigrants have always done, surviving until an opportunity appeared. The opportunity came in the form of a telephone. He landed a job working the night shift as a switchboard operator for the British United River Plate Telephone Company, while simultaneously studying commerce and port administration during the day. The pay was modest, but the position was, as Aristotle immediately understood, extraordinarily valuable. A switchboard operator in 1923 was something like an invisible presence at the center of business life. Every call from every executive, every deal being discussed, every piece of commercial intelligence passing through the city's telephone network passed through his ears first. Aristotle listened, and what he heard he remembered and used. He had already been working to revive his family's tobacco export business. His father and uncle back in Greece were sending Turkish tobacco to Argentina, but young Aristotle needed customers. Argentine cigarette manufacturers had no interest in meeting with a teenage refugee, so Aristotle worked the phones by night and used what he learned to set up deals by day, presenting himself as a sophisticated importer during business hours, while still plugging cables into sockets at midnight. His big break arrived through a conversation he overheard about a new talking picture, where the main character would smoke cigarettes. Aristotle immediately grasped what that meant. Film was about to make smoking glamorous. Cigarette sales were going to explode, especially among women, whose habits and social freedoms were changing rapidly in the years after the First World War. He needed a cigarette brand aimed specifically at women, something elegant, something that felt like freedom and sophistication. He stalked Juan Gaona, the owner of Argentina's most successful cigarette company, approaching him repeatedly until Gaona finally agreed to talk. The audacity paid off. Gaona placed an immediate order worth $10,000 for Turkish tobacco from the Onassis family business. It was the first real deal of Aristotle's commercial life. It would not be the last. By the late 1920s, Aristotle had accumulated enough capital to begin thinking bigger, much bigger. In 1929 he became an Argentine citizen, and around the same time he began to see what would become his true calling. He had grown up watching his father's modest fleet come and go. He understood the rhythms of maritime trade instinctively, and in the early 1930s, with the global shipping industry reeling from the Great Depression, he saw an opportunity that most people missed entirely. When the world was contracting and afraid, Aristotle Onassis was looking for bargains. He found them. Enormous Canadian cargo ships, the kind that normally sold for hundreds of thousands of dollars, were available for almost nothing in the depths of the Depression. Aristotle bought two of them for $120,000, a fraction of their value. Then he hired the crews, signed the contracts, and began building the fleet that would eventually make him one of the most powerful men in the world. The crucial insight that separated Onassis from his competitors was his understanding of the flag of convenience system. By registering his ships in Panama and Liberia rather than Greece or the United States, he could avoid the heavy regulations and higher wage requirements of major maritime nations while still doing business with everyone. His ships sailed tax-free, operated at low cost, and generated returns that competitors running conventional fleets could not match. He also understood oil. In the years before the Second World War, the major oil companies were beginning to require massive tankers to move their product around the world. Onassis signed long-term contracts with companies like Mobil and Texaco at fixed prices before the market shifted. When oil demand exploded after the war, those contracts became extraordinarily profitable. By the 1950s, Aristotle Onassis commanded a fleet of more than 70 vessels. He had offices in New York, Buenos Aires, and Athens. His net worth was climbing into the hundreds of millions. He was one of the wealthiest men alive, and he was still only in his 40s. But wealth alone was never enough for Aristotle Onassis. He didn't just want money. He wanted the world to know his name. He wanted the kind of power that made presidents and princes take his calls, the kind of status that no amount of money could fully purchase, the kind of recognition that would permanently erase the memory of that teenage refugee standing on a dock in 1922 watching his world burn. He was building something much larger than a shipping business. He was building a legend. And some of the methods he used to build it would eventually come back to haunt him in ways he never anticipated. There's something important about Aristotle Onassis that gets lost in all the glamour and the famous names and the legendary yacht. The man was ruthless, genuinely ruthless, and that ruthlessness was not incidental to his success, it was central to it. Consider the whaling operation. Between 1950 and 1956, Onassis ran a whaling fleet off the west coast of South America that operated almost entirely outside the international agreements that were supposed to limit the size, number, and timing of whale harvests. His factory ship and the catcher vessels that accompanied it slaughtered whales of all sizes, ages, and species, with complete disregard for conservation. When Norwegian sailors who worked aboard his vessels later testified about what they had witnessed, the descriptions were horrifying. Entire days of killing, mostly young whales, with the ocean running red. In 1954, the Peruvian government had had enough. They sent naval vessels and Air Force planes to intercept the Onassis fleet. Bombs were dropped near his factory ship. Most of the fleet was captured and taken to the Peruvian port of Paita, where the ships were interned. Onassis eventually paid fines and sold the entire whaling operation to a Japanese company for $8.5 million. But the episode revealed something important about the way he operated. International rules were obstacles to be worked around. Other people's resources were there for the taking. The only law that truly bound him was the law of profit. The same ruthlessness applied to his dealings with governments. In the early 1950s, Onassis had negotiated a stunning deal with the King of Saudi Arabia to transport Saudi oil exclusively on his tankers. If it had gone through, it would have broken the American oil company's monopoly on Saudi petroleum and made Onassis richer than nearly any individual in history. But the United States government was not about to allow that. The FBI investigated Onassis for fraud, charging him with violating shipping laws that required U.S. flagged ships to be owned by American citizens. He entered a guilty plea and paid $7 million in fines. The Saudi deal was killed. What makes this episode particularly remarkable is what came out years later. Reports suggested that Robert Maho, a former FBI agent working for Vice President Richard Nixon, was tasked with destroying the Onassis deal by any means necessary. The mission reportedly included, if necessary, the authority to have Onassis killed. Nixon was said to have commented privately that if it came to that, it should not happen on American soil. Aristotle Onassis, at the height of his power, was being treated as a threat serious enough to warrant assassination. That is how dangerous his ambitions had become to those who wished to control the world's oil supply. He survived that episode. He survived the legal battles. He survived the fines and the investigations and the diplomatic pressure. Because men like Aristotle Onassis don't survive by playing by other people's rules. They survive by understanding which battles to fight and which to walk away from. But the experience taught him something important. True power wasn't just economic. True power was political, social, dynastic. True power was about the company you kept and the names attached to yours.
Dat aanbedings op een lees is, as al die most definitely ou arch. Dat onderwerp is was dearly eternally moldems for speech recognition, the tradition was taxaris, expectamis.
In 1953, Aristotle Onassis arrived in Monaco. At that point, Monte Carlo was still what it had been for over a century, a playground for European aristocracy and wealthy tourists, built around the famous casino and the glamour of the principality's history. Onassis saw something different. He saw a financial and strategic opportunity. Through a series of transactions conducted via front companies registered in Panama, he quietly accumulated controlling shares in Monaco's Société Billionaire, the company that owned the Monte Carlo Casino, the Monaco Yacht Club, the Hôtel de Paris, and roughly a third of the entire country's landmass. He moved his headquarters to Monaco's Avenue d'Ostende and effectively became the most powerful private citizen in the principality. Prince Rainier III initially welcomed him. Monaco needed investment and Onassis had capital, but the relationship between the two powerful men deteriorated quickly. They had fundamentally different visions for what Monaco should become. Onassis wanted to keep the principality as an exclusive destination for an elite clientele, a private jewel of the Mediterranean. Rainier wanted hotels, tourists, broader economic development. Their disagreements became increasingly bitter. In 1966, Rainier used his authority to create 600,000 new shares in the company, permanently held by the state. This single move diluted Onassis' stake from majority control to less than a third. Onassis challenged the action in Monaco's Supreme Court. The court ruled against him. He sold his holdings and left the country, reportedly muttering that he had been cheated. The Monaco defeat stung, but it was a minor setback compared to what Onassis was building in other areas of his life. Throughout the 1950s, his fleet kept growing. His fortune kept expanding. His social circle kept rising. He bought an island in Greece called Scorpios and transformed it into a private paradise, building a villa and establishing the kind of retreat that only extraordinary wealth makes possible. He named his legendary super yacht the Christina O, after his daughter, and filled it with treasures that would have looked at home in a museum. The bar stools were covered in the foreskin of sperm whales. The taps were gold. Former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill was a regular guest.
The world took notice.
In 1956, the Greek government decided to privatize its national airline. Onassis won the contract and took control of Olympic Airways. He threw himself into the project with genuine passion, buying cutting-edge aircraft, installing gold-plated cutlery in first class, personally overseeing service quality, and transforming Olympic from a struggling state enterprise into one of the most admired airlines in Europe. In the last year of his ownership, Olympic Airways carried 2.5 million passengers and employed more than 7,000 people. One of his senior directors later said something that captured Aristotle's relationship with the airline perfectly. He was married to the sea, this director explained. But Olympic was his mistress. He spent the money he made at sea on his mistress in the sky. By the late 1950s, Aristotle Onassis was at the peak of his worldly achievement. He possessed the largest private shipping fleet on Earth. He owned an airline, a casino, a private island, a legendary yacht, properties in Paris, London, Athens, Monte Carlo, New York, and Acapulco. He held stakes in 95 multinational businesses on 5 continents. He had bank accounts in 217 banks around the world. He was also married, and his marriage, like almost everything else in his life, was complicated. In December 1946, Aristotle married Athena Levanos, known as Tina, the 17-year-old daughter of Greek shipping magnate Stavros Levanos. He was 40. The marriage united two of the most powerful shipping families in the world and delivered a social status that, as one of his biographers noted, also gave Aristotle a kind of satisfaction in proving himself to the Greek establishment that had once looked down on him. They had two children, a son, Alexander, born in 1948, a daughter, Christina, born in 1950. For a time, the family projected the image of wealth and stability. The children attended prestigious schools. They traveled between magnificent properties. They wanted for nothing. But underneath the surface, the marriage was rotting from the beginning. By the mid-1950s, Aristotle and Tina were living separately. According to Onassis's biographer Peter Evans, the definitive break came when Tina discovered Aristotle in bed with a close friend of hers at their home in Cap d'Antibes. The betrayal was total. Whatever remained of the marriage died in that moment. But Aristotle's infidelity wasn't accidental or opportunistic. He had already met the woman who would become the defining passion of his life. The woman who would occupy his heart even after he married someone else, the woman whose ashes would eventually be scattered off the coast of the island he had bought partly for her. Her name was Maria Callas, and their story was one of the most extraordinary, destructive, and ultimately heartbreaking love affairs of the 20th century. Summer 1957, Venice. At a glamorous party hosted by the famous American gossip columnist Elsa Maxwell, the two most celebrated Greeks in the world met for the first time. Aristotle Onassis, the billionaire shipowner; Maria Callas, the greatest operatic soprano of her generation. Maria Callas was, by any measure, a phenomenon. Born in New York in December 1923 to Greek immigrant parents, she had risen from a difficult, often lonely childhood to become the most acclaimed opera singer in the world. Her voice was not simply beautiful, it was transfiguring. She brought an emotional depth and theatrical intelligence to opera that audiences had never encountered before, making characters like Violetta, Norma, and Lucia di Lammermoor feel as raw and immediate as people you might know. Critics worshipped her. Audiences wept at her performances. She was also, at the time of their meeting, married. Her husband was Giovanni Battista Meneghini, an Italian industrialist 30 years her senior who had discovered her and become her manager and patron. The marriage had given her stability at a crucial moment in her career, but it had also made her, in some ways, dependent. Aristotle was still married to Tina, though in name only. At the party, the attraction between him and Maria was instant and mutual, but it would simmer for 2 years before it ignited in the open. In 1959, Aristotle invited Maria and her husband aboard the Christina for a 3-week Mediterranean cruise. The guest list included Winston Churchill. It was supposed to be a sophisticated gathering of the elite. Instead, it became the most public romantic scandal of the decade. From the beginning of the voyage, Aristotle pursued Maria with every tool in his considerable arsenal. The romantic setting of the Mediterranean, the luxury of the yacht, the steady attention of a man who had never learned to accept the word no. Maria initially found him unattractive and overeager, but persistence on the right person in the right setting has its own kind of power. By the end of the cruise, everyone aboard knew what had happened. Tina, who had enjoyed Maria's company at the start of the voyage, watched the affair unfold before her eyes and hastily disembarked before the journey ended. The gossip columns had already been hinting at a romance. Now there was nothing left to hint at. In November 1959, Maria left her husband. Tina filed for divorce in 1960, citing adultery. The divorce was granted that June. What followed was 9 years of the most passionate, volatile, exhausting relationship either of them would ever know. Friends described their time together as a constant oscillation between ecstasy and warfare. They adored each other and raged at each other in equal measure. For Maria, Aristotle represented something she had never had before, someone whose fame matched her own, someone who understood what it meant to be at the absolute summit of achievement, someone whose Greek heritage connected with hers in a way that felt like home. For Aristotle, Maria offered something equally rare. She was the one person in his world who couldn't be bought or bullied. Her greatness was entirely her own, achieved through a gift he could never manufacture with money. And there was something else. She nurtured him in ways he hadn't experienced since losing his mother in childhood. In that dynamic, part romance and part something deeper and older, he found a comfort he couldn't find anywhere else. But he also destroyed her, systematically, casually, sometimes deliberately. Maria wanted marriage. She wanted children. She wanted what she called a complete life as a woman, not just as a voice. She had largely sacrificed her career for him. Her vocal problems worsened. Her performances became rarer. The relentless technical demands of opera require constant daily practice, and Maria was spending her days and nights focused on Aristotle rather than her voice. She later told the director Franco Zeffirelli that she had been trying to fulfill herself as a woman. She became pregnant, a boy born March 30th, 1960, who died within hours. The loss devastated her. Aristotle was away when it happened. She conceived again in 1963 and lost that baby too. Once again, Aristotle mor, right with Somali predicted. He refused to marry her. Year after year, the commitment she wanted never came. He enjoyed their arrangement. He had grown up in a world where everything could be taken away, and permanent commitments were a kind of vulnerability he couldn't fully accept. And there was something else. Something that even Maria, with all her perceptiveness, perhaps didn't fully see until it was too late. Aristotle had never stopped being ambitious. Maria Callas was the greatest opera singer in the world, but Aristotle was beginning to set his sights on something even more spectacular. By 1963, something had shifted. Aristotle had begun hosting Jacqueline Kennedy, the wife of the American president, aboard the Christina. He paid her extravagant attention. He gave her a diamond necklace. He gave her sister Lee, who had been romantically connected to him, something so insignificant by comparison that Lee later complained a 6-year-old would have been embarrassed by it. The message was unmistakable to everyone who was paying attention. And Maria was paying attention. Then on November 22, 1963, President John F. Kennedy was shot and killed in Dallas. Jacqueline Kennedy became a widow at 34, the most famous widow on earth, frozen in the public imagination in her blood-stained pink suit beside the coffin of her husband. For 5 years, Aristotle continued his relationship with Maria while quietly, carefully courting Jacqueline. Maria watched and waited and hoped that he would come to his senses, that he would realize what they had together, that the depth of their connection would outweigh whatever it was that drew him toward Jackie. She was wrong. On October 20th, 1968, on the private island of Scorpios, the island Aristotle had bought during the height of his romance with Maria, Aristotle Onassis married Jacqueline Bouvier Kennedy. The world was stunned. Newspapers that had been covering the marriage with anticipatory disbelief now splashed the images across their front pages. The most famous widow in American history had married a rough-hewn Greek billionaire old enough to be her father. The Catholic Church in America expressed outrage. Ordinary Americans felt something close to betrayal. Maria Callas in her Paris apartment was reported to be near collapse. Before the wedding, Ted Kennedy had negotiated a financial agreement on Jackie's behalf. She would receive $3 million immediately, plus $1 million for each of her 2 children. Upon Aristotle's death, she would receive $150,000 annually for the rest of her life. In other words, this was as much a business arrangement as a romance. The marriage was troubled from its earliest days. The couple inhabited 6 residences across 3 countries, but they spent increasingly little time actually together. Jackie preferred New York. Aristotle was drawn back repeatedly to Paris, where he was meeting Maria again. According to people close to Aristotle, Even while married to Jackie, he was continuing a clandestine relationship with Maria, telling her what he had never quite managed to say while he had the chance to act on it, that she was the true love of his life. In his private moments, he may have even believed that Jackie had brought some kind of curse down on his family. Both of the Kennedy brothers she had been connected to had been assassinated, and now the people close to him whispered the curse had followed her into his world. They were about to find out how right they were. January 22nd, 1973, Athens. 23-year-old Alexander Onassis arrived at Ellinikon International Airport for what should have been a routine test flight. As president of Olympic Aviation, his father's subsidiary airline, Alexander, was overseeing a pilot assessment for a potential new recruit named Donald McCusker. Alexander had earned his pilot's license in 1967 and accumulated 1,500 hours of flying time. He loved flying. It was one of the few things in his life that felt entirely his own, unconnected from the overwhelming shadow of his father. Alexander's relationship with Aristotle had always been complicated. As a child, he had been devastated by his parents' divorce. As a teenager, he had watched his father's very public affair with Maria Callas reshape the family's world. And in 1968, when he was 19 years old, he had been horrified to learn that his father intended to marry Jacqueline Kennedy. He reportedly said that his father loved the names and Jackie loved the money. The resentment ran deep. In the months before that January morning, Alexander had begun pushing back against his father's control more aggressively than ever before. He had announced that he intended to leave Olympic Airways and marry Fiona Campbell Walter, a woman 16 years his senior, a former baroness, beautiful and independent, of whom Aristotle deeply disapproved. The two had been locked in serious confrontations about both the business and the relationship. Alexander was preparing to break free. He never got the chance. On that January afternoon, Alexander boarded his personal amphibious aircraft with McCusker and his regular pilot Donald McGregor. The plan was simple: practice some landings. A few seconds after takeoff from runway 33, the plane's right wing dropped and stayed down. The aircraft crashed. The entire flight lasted no more than 15 seconds. All three men were seriously injured. Alexander was rushed first to an American military-based hospital near the airport, then transferred to the Kayite Hospital in Athens. Aristotle was in New York City when the call came. Witnesses said he collapsed from the shock before pulling himself together and moving as fast as private aviation could carry him. He arrived in Athens the next day with Jackie, going directly to the hospital. Alexander's mother Tina arrived from Switzerland with her husband, Stavros Niarchos, who had become Aristotle's most bitter rival. Aristotle flew a renowned English neurosurgeon named Alan Richardson from London to Athens. The diagnosis was devastating. Alexander had suffered catastrophic brain injuries. There was no chance of survival. At 7 in the evening on January 23, 1973, 27 hours after the crash, Alexander Onassis died. He was 24 years old. The two American pilots who had been aboard survived with relatively minor injuries. That discrepancy, the fact that his son had died while the others lived, consumed Aristotle. He refused to believe it was an accident. A skilled pilot with 1,500 hours of experience doesn't die in a 15-second flight while everyone else walks away. It had to be murder. It had to be sabotage. He looked at his enemies and saw suspects everywhere. The CIA, the Greek military junta, his rival Stavros Niarchos, Olympic Airways employees. Someone had killed his son. Someone had to pay. In December 1974, Aristotle took out a paid advertisement offering $1 million for proof that Alexander's death had been deliberate. The official inquiry had concluded it was an accident caused by reversed aileron cables installed incorrectly during routine maintenance. Aristotle didn't believe it. He couldn't allow himself to believe it, because if Alexander's death was a meaningless mechanical failure, a random cosmic cruelty with no human villain, then it was simply unfair. simply pointless, and that possibility was more than he could bear. The reward was never paid. All charges were eventually dropped. Years later, one of the surviving pilots received a settlement from Olympic Airways. The official cause remained what it had always been, a maintenance error, nothing more. But for Aristotle Onassis, the truth of what had happened did not matter. His son was dead. The boy he had raised to inherit the empire, to carry the Onassis name forward into a future he would not live to see, was buried on Scorpios at 24 years old. And with Alexander, something in Aristotle died too. Friends and associates who knew Aristotle before and after his son's death described it as the death of two people. Alexander was buried on Scorpios, and a version of Aristotle Onassis was buried alongside him. The vibrant, relentless, almost supernaturally energetic man they had known for decades became a ghost of himself. He aged overnight. The physical changes were dramatic. The psychological changes were more profound. The man who had survived the burning of Smyrna, poverty, exile, government investigations, corporate battles, and 3 decades of building an empire in a world that was constantly trying to destroy him, could not survive the death of his son. He had always been superstitious. Now those superstitions took over. The pattern was undeniable to him. John Kennedy, killed. Bobby Kennedy, killed. And now his son, dead at 24. Jackie Kennedy was a curse. She had brought death into his family. He had married her despite everything, had sacrificed Maria Callas for her, and this was the price he had paid. His relationship with Jackie deteriorated completely and rapidly. She spent less and less time with him, preferring her life in New York. The marriage that had once shocked the world became an empty legal arrangement, two people bound by a contract that neither of them had any use for anymore. His daughter Christina, who had never hidden her hostility toward Jackie, reinforced her father's darkest suspicions at every opportunity. The household became saturated with grief and resentment. Aristotle's health began to fail. He had experienced respiratory problems for years, but now they worsened dramatically. In the last 18 months of his life, he was often too ill to conduct business with the energy that had always defined him. His eyelids drooped from a neuromuscular condition called myasthenia gravis that robbed him of the physical presence that had always been one of his most potent instruments. He wore tape to hold his eyelids open. He was still fighting, but you could see that the fight was costing him something he could not replace. The empire he had built with such consuming passion lost its appeal. What was the point of the ships, the properties, the companies, the accounts in 217 banks? What was the point of any of it if there was no one to pass it to? The son he had groomed was gone. The daughter he loved was struggling with her own battles. The woman he had actually loved was in Paris, waiting. Because Maria Callas was waiting. Even now, even after everything, he turned back to her in those final terrible months. They spent time together in Paris, reconnecting with a tenderness that their earlier relationship had rarely allowed. He reportedly told her again that she was the true love of his life. She already knew. She had always known. The recognition came too late to change anything, but it must have meant something to both of them. In early 1975, Aristotle's condition deteriorated beyond the point where any ordinary life was possible. He checked himself into the American Hospital of Paris in Neuilly-sur-Seine. He brought with him a red cashmere blanket from Hermes that Maria had given him. Even at the end, in a hospital bed surrounded by doctors and medical equipment, with his empire and his yacht and his island and his famous name spread across every financial record in the Western world, the thing he held on to most tightly was a blanket from the woman he had never stopped loving. On March 15, 1975, at the age of 69, Aristotle Socrates Onassis died of respiratory failure. He was buried on Scorpios next to his son. His sister Artemis would join them later, and in 1988 his daughter Christina, who had married 4 times and never found the happiness her father's empire could not buy, died of a heart attack at 37 years old in Buenos Aires, and was buried beside them too. The island that had been the setting for so many of the great acts of Aristotle's life, the romance with Maria, the wedding to Jackie, the growth of an empire and the collapse of one, became in the end a private cemetery where all the most important people in his life were slowly gathered. After Aristotle's death, Christina negotiated a settlement with Jackie Kennedy, paying her $25 million in exchange for Jackie not contesting the will. Jackie received her annuity payments for the rest of her life. Christina inherited 55% of her father's estate, then estimated at $500 million. The remaining 45% funded the Alexander S. Onassis Foundation, established in memory of the son who had died too young. Maria Callas never recovered. She had given up her career, her voice, her health, and 2 decades of her life for a man who had ultimately married someone else. She had waited, she had hoped, she had been right in the end, that Aristotle loved her more than he loved anyone. She simply hadn't been glamorous enough in the right way at the right moment. She had been too real, too demanding, too much herself for a man who wanted the most famous woman in the world on his arm. On September 16, 1977, 2 years after Aristotle's death, Maria Callas died alone in her Paris apartment of a heart attack. She was 53 years old. In 1979, her ashes were scattered off the coast of Scorpios, finally placing her to rest near the man who had been both her greatest love and the greatest source of pain she had ever known. The empire itself slowly scattered. The Christina yacht was eventually sold and transformed. Olympic Airways went through years of turmoil before being returned to the Greek government. Scorpios remained in the family for decades before eventually passing out of Onassis' hands. The properties, the businesses, the tankers, the influence, all of it dispersed across time and inheritance and the indifferent motion of commerce. What remained was the foundation. The Alexander S. Onassis Public Benefit Foundation is still active today, supporting education, medicine, culture, and the arts. It promotes Greek heritage worldwide, funds scholarships for Greek university students, awards prizes in multiple fields, and keeps the name of the boy who died at 24 alive in a way that makes the tragedy slightly less arbitrary. A father who lost everything built something in memory of that loss that outlasted everything else he constructed. There is a strange mercy in that, a strange justice. Aristotle Onassis spent his entire adult life doing what men of his particular hunger always do. He tried to build something permanent enough, large enough, powerful enough to protect him from the chaos and the loss that had defined his earliest years. He had stood on a dock at 16 watching his world burn, and from that moment until the last moment of his life, he was building walls against that fire. Ships, companies, contracts, properties, marriages to famous women, an empire so vast that surely, surely nothing could break through. It broke through anyway, in the worst possible way. Not through a rival's machinations, not through a government investigation, not through any of the forces that had tried to stop him over the decades and failed. It broke through in the form of a 15-second flight that ended in a crash, and a 24-year-old boy who never woke up. You cannot build walls high enough to keep grief out. You cannot buy your way past the losses that actually destroy you. Aristotle Onassis understood commerce, power, leverage, negotiation, the art of the deal, the value of perception, and the importance of timing. He understood all of it with a brilliance that made him legendary. But he didn't understand, or perhaps he never allowed himself to understand, that none of those tools had any power in the only arena that ultimately matters. He sacrificed Maria Callas for Jacqueline Kennedy. He chose the most famous name in the world over the woman he actually loved. He treated his son as an heir rather than a person, pushing and controlling and disapproving until the relationship between them had become a source of confrontation rather than comfort. He built an empire and forgot to tend the things that were more important than the empire. And in the end he recognized it all. That's the cruelest part of his story. He had enough time, in those last broken months in Paris, to understand exactly what he had lost and why, to hold a red cashmere blanket and know what it represented, to visit Maria and tell her what he should have told her decades earlier, to understand with perfect clarity the cost of every choice he had made.
He died knowing that is not a small thing.
Some empires are brought down by rivals, some collapse under their own weight. Some are destroyed by governments or wars or the shifts in history that no individual can prevent. The empire Aristotle Onassis built outlasted him in pieces, scattered across foundations and settlements in the hands of a grandchild he never knew. But the man himself was destroyed by something older and more powerful than any of the forces he had ever faced. He was destroyed by the love he hadn't given enough, by the love that came back to him too late, by the love that turned to grief when a plane fell out of the sky over Athens on a January afternoon in 1973. The refugee from Smyrna who became a billionaire, the man who loved Maria Callas and married Jackie Kennedy, the tycoon who built the world and could not hold it, the father who discovered, too late, that all the ships in all the oceans were worth nothing compared to one more day with his son. History remembers Aristotle Onassis as one of the great self-made men of the 20th century, a figure of almost mythological ambition and force. And he was. He earned that legacy completely. But the truest version of his story is simpler than any of the headlines, simpler than the yachts and the famous women and the fleet of tankers and the private island. It is the story of a man who had everything and understood, only when it was too late to act on that understanding, what everything actually means. In the end, the man who survived the burning of Smyrna was undone not by enemies or rivals or governments. He was undone by an ordinary grief that wealth had made him unprepared to face. And perhaps that is the most human thing about him.